of it. Here was the freedom to wander and explore the oddities and absurdities of the human mind, the ebb and flow of thought, the sudden diversions of verbal consciousness. Here Molloy reflects on seeing a nameless character he seems to have known. All that inner space one never sees, the brain and heart and other caverns where thought and feeling dance their Sabbath. He looks old, and it is a sorry sight to see him solitary after so many years, so many days and nights unthinkingly given to that rumour rising at birth and even earlier, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Now low, a murmur, now precise as the head waiter's, and to follow, and often rising to a scream, and in the end, or almost, to be abroad alone by unknown ways in the gathering night with a stick. Such prose may be difficult to follow, but often gives up its meaning on a second reading if one ponders the context and jumps of Molloy's thought processes, such as they are. The voice has its own momentum, following the breathing of the narrator. In this voice, Beckett had found the freedom to include meditation, poetry, philosophical musings, all filtered through the wry, hard-bitten humour of his own vision. There was no plot, only the occasional rambling story or memory. The reader, like the writer, was expected to immerse himself in the meandering voice of consciousness. This was not easy, but once achieved, was immensely rewarding, by turns entertaining, hilarious, insightful. In this apparent absence of life, all human life was there. Unexpectedly, in the second half of the book, Beckett reverts to the voice of a more recognisably orthodox consciousness. This is Moran, who impinges on the tale of Molloy from his own objective viewpoint. Moran is all that Molloy is not, though in many ways they are the opposite sides of the same coin. Between them they may be said to complete the circle of humanity. Unlike Molloy, Moran believes in willpower, action, and reason. He is a fanatic of habit, a domestic tyrant obsessed with control. In place of the anarchy of Molloy's mind, we encounter paranoia, sadism, and fixation. Both Molloy and Moran are deranged, but in their own separate ways. To revert to Freudian terms, Molloy is sinking into his unconscious, while Moran is drawn toward his superego. Moran's mission is to find Molloy. His voice is a hilarious parody of ordered consciousness. Should I set out on my autocycle? This was the question with which I began. I had a methodical mind, and never set out on a mission without prolonged reflection as to the best way of setting out. It was the first problem to solve at the outset of each inquiry, and I never moved until I had solved it to my satisfaction. Sometimes I took my autocycle, sometimes the train, sometimes the motor coach, just as sometimes, too, I left on foot or on my bicycle, silently, in the night. When Beckett completed Molloy, he realized that his project somehow remained incomplete. He had farther to go, more to say. The second novel in what would eventually become a trilogy was called Malone Dies. This follows on from the previous two voices, especially Molloy's, taking another step into the darkness of the mind. The central character, Malone, is further removed from everyday reality, a fact that is apparent from the novel's opening words. I shall soon be quite dead at last, in spite of all. Perhaps next month. Malone is an aged, impotent, bedridden figure on the point of death, and longing for death, but on his own terms, as far as this is possible. The voice of the novel is a voice approaching its own death. What matters now? It is by turns tragic, by turns hilarious, as Malone contemplates his own impotent ending. I could die today if I wished, merely by making a little effort. But it is just as well to let myself die quietly, without rushing things. Something must have changed. I will not weigh upon the balance any more, one way or the other. I shall be neutral and inert. No difficulty there. Throes are the only trouble. I must be on guard against throes, but I'm less given to them now since coming here. Of course, I still have my little fits of impatience from time to time. Malone has largely lost interest in his past, and instead of remembering, like Molloy, he passes his time and overcomes his boredom by occasionally inventing stories. Typical of these is the pitiful, pointless tale of Lambert and his family who live in misery on their squalid farm in a hollow, floated in winter and in summer burnt to a cinder. The way to it leads through a fine meadow, but this fine meadow did not belong to the Lamberts. The only joy in life for Lambert is slaughtering pigs, which he does on an itinerant basis. Another tale is the grotesque love affair between Hairy Mac and Sucky Moll. This even inspires Malone to poetry. To the lifelong promised land of the nearest cemetery, with his sucky hand in hand, love it is at last leads Hairy. Malone is inspired to ponder on the aged, impotent, and incompetent Hairy Mac. And one can only speculate on what he might have achieved if he had become acquainted with true sexuality at a less advanced age. I am lost. Not a word. The novel ends with Malone's voice in mid-story stuttering into the final inarticulate murmurings and silence of death. Or light, I mean, never, there he will never, never anything, there, any more. The final novel of the trilogy is The Unnameable. There is no denying that this is the most difficult of all to read. Indeed, one unkind critic christened it the unreadable. In keeping with the gradual denuding of humanity that afflicts the voices in Beckett's trilogy, the voice of the unnameable, who may be called Mahud, is that of someone who appears to exist in a limbo after death and before the full extinction of consciousness. Here Beckett takes his philosophical quest to discover what it is that we are and how to justify this state to ourselves to its ultimate conclusion. In Finnegan's Wake, Joyce had split the atom of the word, releasing a vast energy of illusion. Beckett set about dealing with the remnants. By this stage, language itself had fallen apart. Where now? Who now? When now? Unquestioning. I say I. Unbelieving. Questions. Hypotheses, call them that. Keep going, going on. Call that going, call that on. Can it be that one day, off it goes on, that one day I simply stayed in where, instead of going out in the old way, out to spend day and night as far away as possible? It wasn't far. Perhaps that is how it began. Thus begins one of the most sustained assaults on the foundations of our existential awareness ever written. This opening passage of The Unnameable is arguably among the finest philosophical explorations of the 20th century. Much as the voice of the unnameable hovers between existence and non-existence, this passage may be understood as hovering between philosophy and literature. It is neither one nor the other. Too unaesthetic and fragmented to be literature, too personal, even in this reduced state, to be philosophy. Yet Beckett is telling us that this is the state to which all of philosophy, all literature can be reduced. This is the earth out of which these separate specializations have flowered. From such fragmented essentials we build the entire edifice of human thought and expression. Founded on such quicksands rests the structure of all our humanity. As in the previous two novels of the trilogy, the voice mentions previous characters in Beckett's oeuvre. But here it is not simply to refer to them, as if to some past point of navigation on the journey, but to dismiss them. All these Murphys, Malloys, and Malones do not fool me. They have made me waste my time, suffer for nothing, speak of them when, in order to stop speaking, I should have spoken of me and of me alone. These previous attempts have been mere evasions of what it means to be himself. They have been voices smothering the voice which should have spoken of me. Yet the implication remains that this final unexpressed voice is ultimately silence. The voice of the unnameable is also, it would appear, an evasion. Even so, this voice reaches further toward that inexpressible voice than any before it. How can I know? I can't know. If I've spoken of him, I can only speak of me. No, I can't speak of anything, and yet I speak. Perhaps it's of him. I'll never know. How could I know? Who could know? And on it goes, in one long, unbroken flow of words for more than 100 paragraphless pages. This is Beckett's greatest achievement. Yet there is no denying its utter barrenness as art. This is arid territory in the extreme. It may have been necessary for Beckett to cross this territory. Call this going, call this on. But is it necessary for us, the put-upon readers? Do we have to endure all this? If we wish to partake in Beckett's profound divinations, the answer is yes. But many turn of it. Here was the freedom to wander and explore the oddities and absurdities of the human mind, the ebb and flow of thought, the sudden diversions of verbal consciousness. Here Molloy reflects on seeing a nameless character he seems to have known. All that inner space one never sees, the brain and heart and other caverns where thought and feeling dance their Sabbath. He looks old, and it is a sorry sight to see him solitary after so many years, so many days and nights unthinkingly given to that rumour rising at birth and even earlier, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Now low, a murmur, now precise as the head waiter's "and to follow," and often rising to a scream, and in the end, or almost, to be abroad alone by unknown ways in the gathering night with a stick. Such prose may be difficult to follow, but often gives up its meaning on a second reading if one ponders the context and jumps of Molloy's thought processes, such as they are. The voice has its own momentum, following the breathing of the narrator. In this voice, Beckett had found the freedom to include meditation, poetry, philosophical musings, all filtered through the wry, hard-bitten humour of his own vision. There was no plot, only the occasional rambling story or memory. The reader, like the writer, was expected to immerse himself in the meandering voice of consciousness. This was not easy, but once achieved, was immensely rewarding, by turns entertaining, hilarious, insightful. In this apparent absence of life, all human life was there. Unexpectedly, in the second half of the book, Beckett reverts to the